My name is Jeff Resnick. I'm Chief of the History of Medicine Division here at the National Library of Medicine. Thank you all for joining us today for the 4th annual NLM Michael E. Debakey Lecture in the History of Medicine. And to those of you who are on Twitter, thank you very much for following along using the hashtag NLMHistTalk. This event is part of the NLM's 2020 History Talks, an annual series designed to promote awareness and use of NLM historical collections for research, education, and public service in biomedicine, the social sciences, and the humanities. The series also supports the commitment of the NLM to recognize the diversity of its collections, which span 10 centuries, encompass a range of digital and physical formats, and originate from nearly every part of the globe. Moreover, the series aims to appreciate the diversity of individuals of various disciplines who value these collections and use them to advance their research, their teaching, and their learning. Today's program, like all of our lectures, is being live streamed globally and subsequently will be archived by NIH videocasting. Both efforts are made possible by a generous gift to the National Library of Medicine by the Michael E. Debakey Medical Foundation. And it is that gift which, in 2016, helped our institution to establish the NLM Michael E. Debakey Fellowship in the History of Medicine. The fellowship provides up to $10,000 to support research in the historical collections of the NLM, which include the papers of Michael E. Debakey, and papers which represent the diverse areas in which Dr. Debakey made a lasting impact, such as surgery, medical education, healthcare policy, and much more. The gift of the Debakey Medical Foundation to the NLM also made possible this portion of NLM's History Talks, the annual Michael E. Debakey Lecture in the History of Medicine. In February of this year, the NLM released its call for fellowship applications for the year 2021. If you're interested to apply, please visit the website of the History of Medicine Division for complete details. You can Google NLM HMD, History of Medicine Division, and you'll find our site and go to the site dedicated to the fellowship program. Applications for this cycle are due very soon on September 25th, 2020. And if you missed the deadline, please look for the call for fellowship applications for the year 2022 early next year from the NLM. It's now my distinct pleasure and privilege to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Sara Farhan, who is Assistant Professor of History in the Department of International Studies of the American University of Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates. In 2019, Dr. Farhan was an NLM Michael E. Debakey Fellow in the History of Medicine at the National Library of Medicine. She joins us today to share outcomes of her research on the internationalization of the medical profession, with attention to the field of surgery in the medical schools of Baghdad and Beirut, and the central role of Dr. Michael E. Debakey in this internationalization process. A native of Iraq, Dr. Farhan received her doctorate in history from York University in Toronto, Canada. Specializing in the modern history of Iraq and the history of medicine in the Middle East, as well as the history of medical education and cultural history, Dr. Farhan is author of numerous articles which have appeared in journals such as the British Journal of Middle Eastern Studies, the Journal of Contemporary Iraq and the Arab World, Left History, and the International Journal of Contemporary Iraqi Studies. Her research continues in a variety of directions related to the work that she's presenting today, and with several more articles currently in the pipeline. Please join me where you are in welcoming Dr. Farhan, who will deliver the 4th annual NLM Michael E. Debakey Lecture, Debakey in Baghdad and Beirut, the Internationalization of Surgical Education, 1945 to 1970. So with this, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Farhan. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Resnick. First, I'd like to start by recognizing that Dr. Michael Debakey's birthday was 2 days ago. So I will consider this talk as a belated celebration of this incredible pioneer. I also want to take a second to thank the selection committee of the Debakey History of Medicine for affording me the generous funds that assisted me in conducting this research when I was a fellow at the Library of Medicine. I had high hopes of hoping to return and do further research this summer, but unfortunately I will have to postpone it. I personally want to thank Dr. Resnick for your ongoing support and believing in this project, and also a tremendous thank you to your team, particularly Beth Mullen, as well as Lindsay France. It is an honor for me to be delivering the 4th annual National Library of Medicine Michael E. Debakey Lecture in the History of Medicine. Dr. Shelley McKellar, who delivered the inaugural Michael E. Debakey Lecture in the History of Medicine, stated in her interview with the National Library of Medicine, quote, "I think that there are so many aspects of Dr. Debakey's multifaceted career that could be explored. For example, what about his vision and impact regarding medical education?" End quote. My lecture today attempts to highlight Debakey's impact on medical education, particularly in the Middle East. This lecture is part of a research project that traces the pedagogical structure of medical education in the Middle East in relation to the United States. For this lecture, I will highlight Debakey's contributions to medical education, particularly surgery, in the Middle East. He is a central figure in this project as the links he forged in the Middle East extend beyond his medical contribution. As I will mention today, Debakey's heritage was a source of pride to not only doctors, but the general population in the Middle East. When mentioned, almost always, his Lebanese heritage is underscored alongside his innovation, research, and professional accomplishments. And so it is in the backdrop of these themes that I present to you the fourth annual Michael Elias Debakey History of Medicine Lecture, Debakey in Baghdad and Beirut, the Internationalization of Surgical Education. In 1957, prominent American surgeon Alan O. Whipple gave a lecture titled The Training of the Surgeon as part of the Charles R. Drew Memorial, which he later published in the Journal of the National Medical Association. Whipple's lecture provides us with a unique perspective about American surgeons' perceptions of training and pedagogies in other parts of the world. To Whipple, surgeons trained using American pedagogies obtained unmatched skills that he believed were far superior to other models used in other faculties around the world. In his address, Whipple criticized surgical pedagogies in Europe and in the Middle East, with the exception of the American University of Beirut, where he said the other institutions lack a structure, system, and bedside teachings. He stressed that the American University of Beirut, where his understudy, Joseph McDonald, was Dean of Surgery, was the only worthwhile institute in the Middle East. He therefore considered the American University of Beirut as a suitable training faculty for training skilled surgeons. However, Whipple's opinion was undoubtedly rooted in the fact that his understudy, and therefore the extension of his knowledge, i.e. Joseph McDonald, reached Beirut. And yet at the time of Whipple's address, American, Canadian, European, and Australian surgeons and doctors alike flocked to the Middle East to obtain high-ranking positions within medical faculties, a prospect that carried little competition and high degree of prestige. Whipple's former resident, Joseph McDonald, was recruited as Dean and Chairman of the Department of Surgery at the American University of Beirut in 1946. It must be stressed that Whipple's assessment was based on limited examination of regional faculties. He had only assessed two regional faculties, the American University of Beirut and the Medical College in Tehran, Iran. Had Whipple toured other regional facilities, perhaps his assessment would have differed. 3 years prior to Whipple's address, Dr. Michael Debakey conducted a lengthy tour of the region in which he examined 5 medical colleges in 3 countries in the Middle East. These were in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. Debakey came to an entirely different conclusion. According to Craig Allen Miller, Debakey thought that despite limited fundings, medical colleges in the Middle East were praiseworthy. In April of 1954, again 3 years prior to Whipple's address, the 4th Annual Medical Assembly, or MIMA, was hosted by the American University of Beirut. The assembly attracted regional as well as international attention. It had audience and participants that included prominent figures in medicine, including Michael E. Debakey. Debakey's attendance was of particular significance because the organizing committee of MIMA requested his presence in 1953, but he did not attend. The 1954 request, however, was much more pressing since it accompanied the persuasion of the U.S. State Department. And so Debakey left to Beirut on April 7, 1954. His visit commenced with his visit initiated the beginning of a series of interactions between regional faculties and instructors alike. He forged new connections and reinforced existing ones. In this talk, I will highlight these interactions, which I argue were rooted in the experiences that medical professionals, and in particular surgeons, shared. These shared experiences were facilitated by the internationalization of surgical education. Surgeons in the Middle East were not working in a vacuum-isolated environment. On the contrary, they were part of an intricate network of professionals who celebrated the exchange of knowledge and embraced new developments in the field. Central to this discussion is Dr. Michael Debakey. Debakey's footprint in the Middle East was planted prior to his 1954 visit. Medical colleges in the Middle East studied, applied, and taught Debakey's findings. His name was part of the medical lexicon in the region. One of the main objectives of my research is to highlight the shared experiences of medical professionals in different parts of the world, while at the same time critique the notion that modern medicine is Western medicine. Instead, my research stresses that doctors in the Middle East were members of an international professional community where the exchange of knowledge was rooted in lifelong learning, an experience that dispels Orientalist depictions that often contend the East as a backward or a still place where medical knowledge and innovations underwent an arrested development. I argue that medical education transcended national borders. The international dimension of medical education can be observed in the 19th century, when international public hygiene and sanitation committees were formed in order to come to a universalist approach in handling disease outbreaks. These dimensions were broadened after World War I, where political rationales about peace, cooperation, and mutual understandings reinforced existing educational networks and established new ones. However, it was after World War II, with the establishment of the World Health Organization, that the internationalization of medical education really became centralized. More pointedly, the links that the internationalization of medical education took form in the aftermath of World War II as a result of this understanding that a unified vision of how to promote education can be conducted beyond politics, beyond national borders. And this really limited colonial enterprises in the Middle East. And this was also a time when anti-colonial movements were taking form in the region. This was a critical moment in the history of American pedagogical hegemony. The United States, which has already established educational networks in the Middle East, was able to capitalize off of the weakening ties between former European colonies and interject as a more viable options for students seeking postgraduate education. In particular, American medical missions in the Middle East can be traced back to the 19th century. However, in the aftermath of World War II, we do see an increase in graduate students seeking postgraduate certifications at American institutions. There are numerous explanations to this trend, but I would like to stress two main points. One being that France and England, the two major colonial powers in the Middle East, faced the consequences of post-colonial movements that worked to sever ties with the colonial center. These weakening ties were further pronounced during World War II, when France and England incurred substantial damages. Secondly, the United States' quick resolve to replace European educational missions were welcomed by the Middle East educated classes. With the backdrop of these geopolitical dimensions, we see emboldened education relationships between the United States and the Middle East. More pointedly, American medical education was established in the Middle East in the 19th century with the founding of the Syrian Protestant College in Beirut, later to be known as the American University of Beirut. The medical college facility of AUB, which is the American University of Beirut, trained a plethora of Arab students who then went on to the United States to pursue further qualifications. Therefore, American pedagogical authority in the Middle East has deep roots. In the aftermath of World War II, heightened Arab nationalist movements took form in anti-colonial protests. Many of these movements' leaders were educated in faculties like the AUB. Depicting European powers' intervention in local affairs as a detriment to independence positioned the United States as a more viable option to obtaining specialization in the colonial centers, be it in London or Paris. It was also during this period of heightened Arab nationalism that Dr. Michael Elias Debakey's work gained increased attention in the region. Central to this trend is Debakey's Lebanese heritage. Being of Arab descent, Debakey was seen as yet another example of Arab contributions to the history of medicine. Arab doctors were empowered by Debakey's accomplishments. They saw his contribution as one of their own. It gave them dignity and pride. Local doctors and aspiring students alike harmonized their knowledge with his contributions by stressing their shared professional experience as well as their Arab heritage. As we will see, Debakey became an extension of the region's contribution to the history of advancement in modern medicine. He's positioned alongside prominent historical figures in medicine, such as Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina, or commonly known as Avicenna in Western culture. Debakey's presence in Baghdad and Beirut was a confirmation of these sentiments. Throughout the modern history of the Middle East, medicine played an important part of the centralization efforts of the various regions that governed this area, this area. In particular, modern Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon were under the Ottoman Empire, where central leadership was in Istanbul, with designated local governors operating in urban centers. While historians agree that the Arab peripheries of the Ottoman Empire were exploited for their human and natural resources, administratively, the region was neglected. There's a gradation to this neglect, however, where Iraq suffered the most from limited finances and attention paid to development projects. Medical education, however, was a viable option in Istanbul, where the Imperial Medical College was located. The sons of affluent dignitaries who could afford education flocked there, and it was an opportunity for them to integrate into the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. In 1867, American missionaries opened a medical college in Beirut. French Jesuits followed soon thereafter by opening the St. Joseph's Medical College in 1889. The Ottoman state initially viewed these institutions with suspicion, as concerns over foreign influence in the Arab peripheries occupied debates amongst policymakers in Istanbul. The state responded with a series of medical education regulations and allocated funding for an Imperial Medical College in Damascus, which is modern-day Syria. This facility opened in 1903. So at the turn of the century, aspiring doctors of affluence residing in the Arab periphery saw themselves at an intersection where their capital played a crucial part. And if they could afford the opportunity for foreign education abroad, they definitely took it. The options were more likely to be Paris and Berlin. With the collapse of the Ottoman Empire following World War I, American influence in Beirut remained almost unchanged. But the French essentially controlled the region. Lebanon and Syria were governed under the French mandate as a part of the award they received in 1918, and Iraq was given to England. Damascus transitioned from an Imperial Ottoman Medical College to an Arab institute, but the city was now under the French mandate. As such, instructing in Arabic emphasized a form of resistance to the colonial enterprise. But, and as we shall see, this hindered the level of knowledge exchange afforded in Damascus. Iraq, on the other hand, became a mandate of England, and it did not have any educational facility at the time. 1927, a medical college in Baghdad was founded, where former British colonial health officers suddenly became professors. Therefore, by the turn of the century, European colonial enterprises were rooted in the foundation and restructuring of medical education. This was then reproduced in medical faculties. Doctors graduating from these facilities pursued further specializations abroad. Certifications tend to be linked to colonial powers, so either London or Paris being the popular options for those who are desiring further qualifications. France was a common choice for St. Joseph graduates, for example, but Baghdad graduates tended to flock towards London. This is also related to the language of instructions at these facilities. In the case of Baghdad, it was instructed in English. The American University of Beirut also in English, and St. Joseph, they instructed in French, so it made more sense for the graduates to pursue further certification in a French-speaking country. During and in the aftermath of World War II, the French and British mandate systems concluded. However, European influence in the region remained. These transformations created tensions between Arab nationalists seeking full independence and European powers that continued to interfere in local affairs. As a result of the devastations European countries incurred, as well as calls for Arab independence, from European domination, educational missions experienced shifts in the aftermath of World War II, where doctors graduating from these regional institutes began to head to the United States for certification and specialization in larger numbers. Records located at the American National Archive in College Park indicate that at least some members of the Department of States were anticipating these shifts. The Department of States engaged with numerous American medical colleges, mainly in New York, Texas, and California, to gauge their willingness to establish foreign education networks between the United States and the Middle East. It also seems that these incentives were not secretive in any way. We see letters from various American pharmaceutical giants writing to the American embassies in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon in hopes of penetrating the markets that previously was dominated by France and England. It is therefore not surprising to see that the State Department encouraged Debakey to head to the 1954 Fourth Annual Middle East Medical Assembly. I speculate that the State Department hoped that Debakey would establish new ties in Beirut in hopes of persuading doctors and politicians alike to consider the United States as a worthwhile ally for medical means, incentive, missions, and campaigns. And yet Debakey was only asked to attend the conference itself, which lasted from April 9th until the 11th. Debakey remained almost a month in the Middle East. He took it upon himself to tour, lecture, and provide applicable instructions at other regional faculties. He not only strengthened the ties with Beirut, but established personal ties to the medical colleges in Aleppo and Damascus in Syria, as well as in Baghdad, Iraq. Debakey's visit was welcomed by local doctors and aspiring students alike. In an interview I conducted in Beirut in 2018, a former medical student, Dr. E. Malouf, recalled the occasion. The young student was so excited to attend the Debakey's address that he wanted to ensure that his coat was ironed before the occasion. He believes that he is a distant relative of Debakey, which I'm sure added to his excitement. The eager student took his coat to a local seamstress to ensure that it was cleaned and pressed before the occasion. However, upon returning to retrieve the coat, the excited student was immediately disappointed to learn that the seamstress had left the city to head to a wedding. Panicked, he rushed to the lecture hall, where he was unfortunately told he cannot attend because he lacked proper attire. So he missed the occasion entirely. Debakey ended up giving other lectures at AUB. He also visited the Medical College of St. Joseph, which is the French facility I mentioned earlier. He then traveled with a local doctor to visit the medical colleges in Syria, which are located in the north in Aleppo as well as Damascus. Debakey lectured at these facilities, but he was very critical of these faculties as well. One of his concerns with the Arab nationalist movement in Syria was thwarting the advancement of medical education. He feared that instruction in Arabic and the ban on books in foreign languages limited the abilities of students in these faculties. I assume his concern was that they weren't participating in this international network that AUB was definitely a part of. After leaving Syria, Debakey headed to Baghdad and visited the Royal Medical College of Iraq. At the time, the dean was Hashim al-Witri, who was a graduate of the Istanbul Imperial College during the Ottoman period. The dean welcomed Debakey and requested that he participate in a number of conferences with the Iraqi Medical Association, as well as provide lectures to students of surgery and practicing surgeons. In his 1954 annual report, Dr. al-Witri states that the visit was informative to the students and faculty alike. Al-Witri was especially pleased to hear Debakey's positive review of the college's surgery module. Debakey spent almost all of April touring regional facilities in the Middle East, providing lectures, instructions, and participating in international and local conferences. However, his footprint in the Middle East predates this 1954 visit. The dean of the medical college in Baghdad highlighted the fact that students in Baghdad studied Michael Debakey's contribution prior to this historic visit. Al-Witri was referring to Debakey's innovation and publications in 1930s and 40s. Surgeons and doctors alike in the Middle East were reading on the operations performed in the United States by Debakey and his mentor, Alton Oshner, among others, well before the historic 1954 visit. As early as 1940, medical journals in the Middle East, particularly in Iraq, cite Debakey's work on the sleeve valve transfusion instrument. They were also familiar with other advances made in this particular subsection of the field, such as Robert Gross's contribution in the 40s. Other works have cited Debakey and Denton Cooley's research on tuberculosis. This was particularly significant in the Middle East in the 1950s when a tuberculosis outbreak was rampant. It was predominantly evident in Iraq, but there are cases in Syria and Lebanon as well. So the work that he's done on tuberculosis is becoming pronounced again. They were also participating in contributing to the field. It wasn't just a one direction. It wasn't a one-direction exchange. The conversations Iraqi doctors were having amongst themselves were in relation to international developments within the field. For example, here I have an article from the medical faculty of Iraq. This was published in 1949, where the authors contemplate the proper approach to how to conduct and treat ductus aortus, which is a fatal congestive heart condition that can cause heart failure and hypertension. The article's conclusions fall in line with Robert Gross as well as Debakey's contribution to this particular condition. Moreover, while conducting research at the Iraqi Medical Archive, I came across clippings of Debakey's research on the sleeve valve, as well as some of the journals that he edited or contributed to. And this is another example. Like I said, the exchange of knowledge was not one-directional. Debakey also studied the works and contributions of doctors and instructors from the Middle East. For example, the works of Lebanese Dr. Amin Khairallah, instructor at the AUB, was examined by Debakey. Khairallah composed a brief collection of medical ethics where medical students learned of the history of ethics, its application, and their ongoing responsibilities to their patients. Khairallah stressed that a doctor's duty does not end when the patient leaves the clinic. This is especially important because it highlights that Debakey celebrated the knowledge exchange shared between the Middle East and the United States. He did not see himself as superior to medical professionals in the region, but as their equal. His relationship with the region and its medical professionals continued to flourish throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Local surgeons following Debakey's work were following Debakey's work quite closely, and they also collaborated in several research projects. For example, in 1956, prominent Iraqi surgeon Yusuf al-Na'man published a paper with Dalton Cooley, Debakey's colleague at Baylor at the time. Their contribution was published in the Journal of Neurosurgery. In 1966, the Cardiothoracic Unit of the Department of Medicine of Baghdad University published an article on rheumatic heart disease in young people in Iraq. The team was led by Dr. Ihsan Raouf al-Bahrani, and they studied 357 patients, many of whom came from Iraq's lower socioeconomic strata. The team compared their findings to other countries in the global south and came to the conclusion that living conditions played a significant role in the development of heart disease. The team considered Dr. Yusuf al-Na'mani, a skilled Iraqi surgeon at the time, as part of this long legacy that Texas-made surgeons. And Na'man forged a friendship with Debakey. He pursued his master's in surgery in Houston in 1950s. So this highlights, again, the international network of cardiovascular society. Moreover, Debakey's relationship with Dr. Yusuf al-Nu'man is highlighted once again in 1980, when the International Cardiovascular Society meeting was scheduled to take place in Baghdad in Iraq. However, Saddam Hussein and Ayatollah Khomeini's diabolical adventures thwarted the event, and the conference had to be postponed. Beyond medical education, Debakey is described as part of a long history of medical pioneers emerging from the region. In 1969, Aramco magazine published an article on medicine in the Middle East, where Debakey is depicted as part of a long historical trajectory of medical development emerging from the region. The article lamented on the brain drain and the Anglicization of other Arab pioneers. It states, it is difficult to evaluate completely the quality and the quantity of Arab work in medicine. Many doctors can be cited who have brilliant promise, but who are still comparatively young, in their late 30s or early 40s. Many are siphoned off by the brain drain, lured not only by higher salaries, but by more prestige or greater facilities for research, notably postgraduate students abroad who simply don't return. In 1966, statistics show the Middle Eastern graduate licensed in practice in the United States alone came to 10% of the area's yearly crop. Once established abroad, they melt into the landscape, and this is particularly important. Arab names are then anglicized, and here they give you an example of a few of them. Akhuri becomes Akhori. This is reference to Dr. Elias Khoury or Elias Khoury. Debakey becomes Debakey, and so on and so forth. So clearly this article is lamenting on the brain drain, but at the same time it highlights the historical trajectory of Arab contribution to medicine. And here, I'm sorry that the image is not very clear, but it states from Abyssinia to Debakey, vision and enterprise in the arts of healing. This is remarkable to be presented in the same category as such historical figures in medicine. But this doesn't stop there. Despite the supposed Anglicization, the Arab world continued to stress Debakey's heritage. In 1977, Debakey is positioned alongside other Arabo-Judaic and Islamic doctors, highlighting, again, a historical continuity. At the same time, however, Debakey's contribution to medicine does emphasize his United States training. In the same magazine, Debakey is referenced as the Texas tornado, or the pioneer of open heart surgery. I think the emphasis on his training in the United States gives him a lot of leverage and prestige in an area that unfortunately at times does not esteem the medical education of the region. He, of course, we know that he performed on numerous prominent politicians and figures in the region, including the Shah of Iran, amongst members of the royal family in Saudi Arabia. But this happened after the period that I concentrate on. But I thought it's worthwhile to mention how what a long-lasting legacy Debakey left in the region. And so to conclude, Debakey remained connected to the Middle East, again, way beyond the timeline that I focus on. He performed on a series of politicians, but also he instructed numerous prominent physicians in the region. His influence extends beyond what I covered today. The archive at the National Library of Medicine, as well as provide a plethora of rarely explored sources, at least in the modern Middle East. And it's definitely worthwhile to, if you have a chance to check them out, because it is remarkable what you discover. One of the sources that really caught my attention was from the Debakey collection, and I want to part ways with it. This is a poem found in a brief medical Bible, which is again Ethics on Medicine by Dr. Amin Khairallah. And it's just a lovely poem that really describes Debakey's life and contributions. And I thought it'd be a great way to close today's lecture. Thank you very much for your attention, And I'd be ready to hear any questions if you'd like me to field any. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Farhan, for a great lecture. Thank you so much. So we do have 25 minutes for questions. And the way we're going to do this is for all of you who are watching via the NIH videocast, with thanks to my colleague Lindsay Franz, who's working behind the scenes, and NIH videocasting colleagues, there is a send live feedback link to which anyone can send a question or a comment. Additionally, if you're following on Twitter, you can instant message me. I am at Jeffrey S. Resnick. And let's see if we have any questions. The questions will be coming directly to my email. While we wait for a few questions, Dr. Farhan, tell us a little bit more about your future projects related to this, perhaps, or branches of your current work that you're pursuing beyond what you have described.
Yes, so like I said earlier, I'm really interested in dispelling this unfortunate notion that the Middle East and their contribution to medicine is sort of ended after the golden age of medicine. So it sort of ceased to exist in the modern period. And instead it became a sponge of Western medicine. So my work sort of reflects that. And I have several projects underway. The one that I'm currently interested in is international students studying or getting certified in the United States. And those that did return and how that sort of exchange of knowledge happened. I'm also interested in comparing these students to doctors, American doctors, as well as British doctors who came and worked in the Middle East for a bit and then returned back to their home country and to study what forms of multi-directional, perhaps multi-layered process that was. The other project I'm really interested in, and actually it's part of the sources that I found at the National Library of Medicine, is a collection of records on neuropsychology and neurology. And so at least in Iraq, it's a very limited field. So you can imagine my excitement when I did come across these records. I'm hoping that in due time I'll be able to return to NLM to see what else I can find.
And we certainly look forward to having you back.
Thank you.
Without question. Thank you. So we do have one question that's come in. Debakey was asked to attend the Middle East Medical Assembly in 1954, April 1954, but he stayed for almost a month lecturing and touring. And the question is, was this additional time in the Middle East encouraged or influenced by the U.S. State Department? Did he have official correspondence with the U.S. government afterward?
From my understanding, the letters that I did see was, we encourage you to go to the to this international conference. There wasn't a formal invitation from the facilities that I did examine. So I examined Beirut, the Medical College of Beirut, and their records, and of course, what remains, unfortunately, of the Medical College of Baghdad's records. That was destroyed after 2003. So I didn't find an official request from these facilities. So my understanding is that this is something that he took upon himself, certainly for Syria, because Syria at the time was experiencing a political turmoil where every few years you'd have a coup d'etat where one military official would overthrow another. So it wasn't necessarily a very positive time to go and establish or assess these facilities, but nonetheless he went there. And I think that he was accompanied with a local, at least a Lebanese local, a young doctor. So I think that might have created some comfort, someone who knows the lay of the land, compared to Iraq, which was more or less stable at the time. This was a kingdom that really worked well with England. England still had a degree of influence in Iraq, but the Iraqi doctors were more willing to engage with foreign doctors. Normally, they'd be communicating with English doctors or other doctors from the Commonwealth. So Debakey's visit was sort of like an exception to this trend, but at the same time, very welcomed exception from the records that the 1954 annual reports from the Medical College indicate.
Thank you. Another question, Dr. Farhan, that's come in via Twitter. This individual writes, I know she has done some work on nursing, referring to you. Could Dr. Farhan also discuss what she has discovered in relation to the internationalization of nursing education in the Middle East or nursing at the American University of Beirut? Thank you.
Actually, I think that I might be confused with another colleague of mine, Dr. Lydia Woodenbrook. I haven't done work on nursing. I briefly discussed nursing in my forthcoming project, but I write it alongside the development of medical education. What I can tell you about nursing in the Middle East, at least in Iraq, was that this was done at a hospital. It started at a hospital basis. There wasn't a formal school established until after the establishment of the medical college. So it was in the 1930s. 1936 is when we see nurses actually living in the hospitals and working, attending classes at the medical college. But prior to that period, the nursing students in Iraq were trained at the major centers, so Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra. And they also tended to be predominantly minorities. The British preferred to work with Iraqi minorities. In the north, for example, they were Armenian Christians. In Baghdad, they were Christians as well as Jews. And in Basra, we have evidence that there's a small Armenian population there that the British preferred to work with. We also have examples of nursing sisters and nursing orderlies that are brought in by the British to help facilitate this training. But my knowledge is unfortunately limited to Iraq, and I would love to do a little bit more work to tell you more about the internationalization of nursing education in the Middle East in general. But I would refer you to my colleague. She's doing phenomenal work on Iran.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Another question that's come in. What sorts of sensitive dynamics did Debakey find he had to navigate in the changing politics of Iraq and the region overall?
Yeah, so my understanding is it became a bit tense when, again, Saddam Hussein and Ayatollah Khomeini decided to go on an 8-year destructive adventure. So like I said briefly, there was the internationalization of the surgical community was really working and thriving. And Iraqi doctors are participating and communicating with the doctors in the United States and other parts of the world, to the point where Dr. Yusuf Al-Na'man really was ready to host the facility. It was supposed to take place in November of 1980, but at that point, Iraq already started its aggression against Iran, and they couldn't really postpone it to next year because, as we know now, no one really thought the war would last that long. I think Iraq thought it would be a quick conclusion. Iran had just undergone a revolution, and it was experiencing its own political turmoil. But really, in my other larger work, I talk about the degradation of Iraqi medical education and infrastructure. And Saddam Hussein really did a number on medical education in Iraq. In addition to severing ties and isolating Iraqi doctors from the larger international community. On a domestic level, there was systemic firing. People were being fired if they weren't aligned with the Ba'athist regime. So here you have Debakey, who has, even prior to 1954, he's been establishing these networks, and he had been nurturing them. And I'm sure he was quite disappointed when he realized that his friends in Iraq are now politically cut off from the community. Also, the conference was rescheduled for 1981, and it was held in Houston. So it was pulled away entirely from the region, which is really significant because one would think that it would be rescheduled at another regional facility, perhaps American University of Beirut. But no, the entire event was rescheduled back to the United States. And that tells us how devastating this was, and that the war wasn't just between the borders between Iran and Iraq. Oh, I apologize. I just remembered that they couldn't have it in Beirut because there was a civil war in Beirut at the time. So really, Debakey's connections were not just disrupted in Iraq, but there was a civil war in Lebanon. So his connections there were also thwarted. The Ba'athist regime in Syria was already alive and well. There were all of these misadventures with regional conflicts taking place. So this period, I would argue, undermined this otherwise really wonderful, nurturing relationship that Debakey established with regional medical professionals, not just surgeons, but other doctors alike. And it was just the Middle East was undergoing a political turmoil, and conflicts, domestic conflicts, civil war, but also neighboring conflicts. So I would imagine that was quite disappointing. But we do have evidence that he visited Saudi Arabia in the 70s, and so the ties there. He had some Jordanian friends as well. But I just want to emphasize that these are, very established political networks, not necessarily professional colleagues.
Thank you. Another question from Twitter regarding your sources. You spoke at length about using sources from the National Library of Medicine, of course. What kinds of sources did you use during your archival work in Iraq? And particularly, how did you find the interviewees you spoke about?
Yeah, so the most challenging part of this project and future projects will always be finding resources that used to be part of an archive. So in Iraq, again, the medical archive was destroyed in 2003. And as a result, we have to piece this history together based on the brain drain. That's how I started. I started following Iraqi doctors in England, Iraqi doctors in Canada and the United States. I started attending with similar doctors who reproduce doctors. So the son of a prominent doctor is more likely to be encouraged to pursue the career, and so on and so forth. So I started that way, and slowly but surely, by 2016, 2017, the Iraqi Medical Archive was fully in operation. So I headed to Iraq and met with the archivist there, and we still maintain a very close relationship. I actually send him some of the stuff that I found in hopes of reestablishing the collection that once was. But it is a very difficult process, and this is why I'm very grateful for Living Archives, conducting interviews with former medical students, oral interviews. Also, they have their notes. They still have their school notes. They have the articles that they read, the exams that they did. So these are really valuable sources that can tell us about this, again, shared experience about doctors in the Middle East. And they were experiencing the same, for example, exam anxiety as a medical student in the United States would have probably experienced as well.
Thank you. Another question has come in. When Dr. Debakey visited China in 1973, this person writes, he made brief comments on acupuncture, both as a therapeutic modality for various illnesses and as a method of anesthesia. And this individual is wondering if, in your research, did you come across Dr. Debakey mentioning any new breakthroughs in medicine as practiced in the Middle East during his visit? Did he comment on that at all?
That's a great question. So I haven't come across anything Debakey particularly said regarding traditional medicine or different approaches to therapy, but I have come across other German and American doctors who have done so, and I can tell you a little bit about that. So in north of Iraq, there is this lake that has minerals in it. And when the British first came to Iraq, they criticized the local population for practicing this approach as a form of therapy. So when somebody had a backache, they would go and hang out in this lake. And it was essentially outside of the lake, there were little hot springs. But by 1930s, we have German doctors writing about this actually being a very beneficial approach to healing. Again, psychological healing or just physical pain. And we also, by 1940s, 1950s, we have other doctors commenting on it from the United States. And they're actually not just commenting on it, but they're suggesting that the government make it a sort of like a medical tourism center in hopes of if somebody was having desiring some form of like a spa day, a medically mandated spa day, they can go ahead there. The other thing I just want to comment about your question is that Debakey was sort of criticized for maintaining his connections with communist countries, especially during the Cold War. And in Iraq, after the overthrow of the monarchy in 1958, we see a series of regimes that are highly critical of the United States. Immediately after 58, we see a regime that aligned itself, at least temporarily, with the communist movement in Iraq. And yet, despite that, Debakey maintained his connection with the Iraqi medical community. So in addition to this fantastic question, I just wanted to add that to Debakey, he really didn't care about these politics. And he didn't sever ties with countries or based on their political affiliation, which is remarkable, again, to find.
Agreed. Well, thank you, Dr. Farhan. I think we're going to bring your hour to a conclusion with thanks from myself, all my colleagues at the National Library of Medicine. We thank you for your lecture today, for taking the time to prepare it at what is a very busy time for everyone who is teaching and undertaking research, and everybody for that matter. And we wish you continued success in your research. We look forward to welcoming you back at the National Library of Medicine, and I wish you all the best in the meantime. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
You too. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you all.